Shakespeare asked, "What's in a name?" When the name is Astor, the answer is easy. For more than 200 years, the Astor name has been synonymous with power, prestige, grandeur, and riches that royalty would envy. The 5 generations of Astors are a fascinating cast of characters. Their lives read like a movie script. There's love, hate, tragedy, and family feuds. It's a saga played out in some remarkable locations, from ballrooms in Newport and New York to the deck of the doomed Titanic. It's an epic story of America's most celebrated high society dynasty, the Astors. The remarkable Astor dynasty began in the tiniest of towns. John Jacob Astor I was born in Waldorf, Germany in 1763. But he didn't stay in his native country for long. At 20, he set sail for America to test the promise that through hard work, anyone could succeed. Scraping up just enough money for steerage passage, Astor made the crossing and landed in Baltimore in March of 1784. He was practically penniless. Astor was a rough, uneducated lad in a foreign land, but he adjusted quickly.
He was able to make friends easily. He must have been extremely charismatic, and he was able to talk to merchants and get advice from older men.
One bit of advice was that there was money to be made in the fur trading business. 3 weeks after arriving in America, John Jacob left Baltimore to join an older brother in New York, then a little village of about 23,000. He landed a job there in a warehouse, a dirty, smelly job beating dust and bugs off the bundles of furs brought back from the Indian territories. But John Jacob was soon promoted to fur trader. Now, fur traders in Astor's time trudged alone in Indian territory. Foot trails into the wilderness were too narrow even for horses, so a man had to be his own pack animal. He carried everything on his back: rifle, axe, knife, and 60 or more pounds of goods to trade. It was backbreaking work with only one bright spot. Sarah Todd was home waiting for him. Sarah was a shy, no-nonsense girl with a nice dowry of $300. In 1785, they were married. John Jacob used his new bride's dowry to start his own fur trading business. It was a time when pelts traded in the wilderness for a pittance would fetch a pretty penny in the outside world. After 10 years of shrewd decision-making and hard work, Astor was so prosperous, he commissioned a portrait of himself. But it wasn't flattering enough for Astor, so John Jacob refused to pay until the artist, Gilbert Stuart, painted a new one.
Stuart made him look exactly the way he looked, and he was not a handsome man. He had a big nose and small eyes, and he got fat rather early.
Stuart complied and created a portrait to make John Jacob look like a refined gentleman. When the new century rolled around in 1800, Astor's fortune was estimated at $250,000, an incredible sum at a time when a family could live handsomely on about $800 a year. But Astor was never satisfied. He invested in ships that took furs around the world. China was a major market, and when the ships returned to America, they were filled with exotic spices, silks, and teas. Astor literally made money coming and going. But if he was proud of his success, he kept it to himself.
He was definitely a very secretive man. He liked to get things done in quietly and not have anyone realize what was going on. And he was thrilled by the idea that he'd made $1 million before anyone knew that he could possibly have come close to that mark.
By middle age, the glint of gold agreed with the once penniless peasant, and soon John Jacob discovered a way to make even more money. Real estate. His first acquisition was a 75-acre lot purchased from a debt-ridden whiskey distiller. Today, Times Square sits on that very parcel of land Astor bought more than 175 years ago. John Jacob's real estate dealings poured even more wealth into his coffers. Astonished by his colossal success, he once said, "Could I begin my life again, I would buy every foot on the island of Manhattan." He eventually sold the fur business and concentrated entirely on real estate. His philosophy was simple: buy in acres, sell in lots. Astor became so rich, it wasn't long before the doors of the elite opened to him.
He was able to use his money well and parlay his way up into more important circles. And I guess he was kind of like a modern-day, an old-fashioned Onassis.
Astor was a charmed man leading a charmed life. Only one cloud darkened his horizon. Of John Jacob's 6 living children, one was mentally disturbed. It was his firstborn son, the one who should have been Astor's primary heir, John Jacob II. Astor hired a doctor to stay with his son all the time. He also built a house with a high wall around it to keep his disabled son confined. Luckily, John Jacob had a younger son to mind the family fortune, William Backhouse Astor. William was a dutiful son, completely trusted by his father. In 1832, John Jacob Astor was forced to face his twilight years and the death of his loyal wife, Sarah. At first, Astor rambled around in their comfortable home, but it held too many memories. So the aging entrepreneur came up with a new way to make money and leave the memories behind. At the age of 70, John Jacob demolished his own home and put up a luxury hotel on Broadway in Manhattan, the first of its kind in America. He called it the Astor House.
And it had 300 rooms, it had 17 bathrooms, it had carpeted corridors, every room had a basin and a pitcher, it had free soap, and of course for all that luxury you would have to expect to pay a lot, and people did. It cost $2 a day.
Despite that exorbitant price, the hotel was a sensation. Anyone who was anyone stayed there. Abraham Lincoln, Charles Dickens, the Prince of Wales, Edgar Allan Poe, even Davy Crockett. The hotel's success made Astor a public figure. With so many people now aware of his tremendous wealth, he received more and more requests for charitable donations, but he always managed to sidestep that issue.
A minister one day came in to see John Jacob Astor and said to him, "Oh, you have the means to do so much good, it must give you a great deal of pleasure." To which John Jacob replied, "Oh, I don't know about that. Having the means doesn't mean that you have the disposition to do good."
On the morning of March 29, 1848, John Jacob Astor died at his home in New York City at age 84. His estate was estimated at a staggering $20 million, making him the richest man in America. He left the bulk of his estate to his second son, William Backhouse. But to everyone's surprise, the will included $400,000 for the Astor Library, which later became the New York Public Library.
Well, $400,000 for a library at that time is an astounding sum. It was a very large sum, but people were more surprised, I think, by the fact that he left anything to charity, that he became a philanthropist on his deathbed was more startling than the sum itself.
In keeping with his lifelong penchant for privacy, Astor's son and heir, William Backhouse, followed his father's wishes and burned 15 cases of John Jacob's letters and business ledgers. But the death of John Jacob was not the end of the dynasty. With the firm foundation laid by the immigrant Astor, William Backhouse continued his father's tradition of being the richest man in America. Rich, but boring. Luckily, though, an interesting Astor came along. An amazing woman would make the Astor name synonymous with high society. When he arrived in America in the late 1700s, John Jacob Astor was determined to make money. He succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, becoming the richest man in his adopted country. When he died in 1848, John Jacob's second-born son, William Backhouse, inherited that title. But so much money brought him so little joy. A colleague said that William sits in his office as if it were a prison to which his father has condemned him for life. William was 56 when his father died, an unhappy man in a well-worn rut. Forlorn or not, William's work perpetuated the family's control of New York real estate. In fact, he nearly fulfilled his father's dream to own every foot of the island of Manhattan. William bought so much property, he was called the landlord of New York. Like his father, William sniffed around for deals on the outskirts of town. One such purchase was a rocky, poor piece of farmland called the Thompson Farm. Today, the Empire State Building stands tall on that very same property. William soon doubled the fortune left to him by his father. As an older man, William counted his blessings. He fathered 6 children, and it was the 2 eldest sons, John Jacob III and William Backhouse Jr., who stood to inherit the family fortune. And that happened in 1875, when the landlord of New York died at the age of 83. Like his father before him, he instructed one of his sons to burn all of his business papers and correspondence upon his death. The 2 oldest brothers inherited $20 million each, an astounding fortune. But the brothers, John Jacob III and William Backhouse Astor, had been born into great wealth, so both took the money for granted. To make matters worse, the brothers didn't like each other. However, they did keep up appearances. Being an Astor by this time meant there were certain obligations. So William Jr. made a marital match to please his family, the first and last time he was so dutiful.
The younger brother, William Backhouse Jr., marries very well. She's one of the old Dutch families of New York, Caroline Schermerhorn Astor. Sort of a big, plain-looking, big-boned girl. And they proceed to have 4 daughters right away. And then, fortunately, at last, a son, at which point his job is done and he can go off and have a good time on his yacht.
With a son to inherit the family fortune, William returned to the difficult business of having fun. But he had that fun without the company of his aristocratic wife. This earned William Backhouse Jr. the title of the first Playboy Astor. William's wife, the haughty Caroline Astor, stayed at their stately Fifth Avenue mansion. She ignored the gossip and kept busy creating a life of her own as the undisputed queen of high society. Her elegant balls and parties were the talk of the town.
Right after the Civil War, there was lots of money floating around, and a huge amount of riffraff came into town, and Caroline decided she had to protect her daughters at all costs from this unsavory group of people with lots of money.
So Caroline decided to organize society so that only the best people from New York's most established families were invited to her balls. And Mrs. Astor made sure they were the grandest social events anyone had ever seen. Her secret was to keep the guest list exclusive, very exclusive, usually no more than 400 people. The chosen ones became known simply as the 400.
People often say, well, that's the number who could fit into Mrs. Astor's ballroom, but actually that isn't true at all. Certainly 800 people could easily fit in, but the idea was that Caroline Astor was trying to make society exclusive.
The end result was that if you weren't invited to Mrs. Astor's balls, you weren't in society. Her reign was so total that the uninvited invented excuses to be out of town rather than admit to being in town and not at the party. From the mid-1870s on, Mrs. Astor was the monarch of Manhattan. She certainly wore more jewels than real royalty. It was the age of the rich flaunting their wealth. If you got it, flaunt it, and Caroline did.
She had diamonds galore around her neck, tiaras, huge dresses with trains. She had a stomacher, a brooch that you could put on your stomach that was about this size, just packed with diamonds.
And what better place to show off her jewelry than at her own extravagant parties, some of which cost $200,000. Guests were served exquisite dinners on golden plates. There were lavish floral arrangements, costing $1 per stem. Mrs. Astor received her guests standing alone under a life-sized portrait of herself. Soon, Caroline was simply called Mrs. Astor, no first name necessary. She enjoyed getting mail when visiting her 60-room cottage at Newport, so Caroline told people to simply address letters to Mrs. Astor, Newport, because even the post office knew there was only one Mrs. Astor. That's how Caroline saw it. But her young nephew, William, son of John Jacob III, had a very different view.
This whole the Mrs. Astor is getting very complicated. The males are getting hopelessly mixed up. Feathers are getting ruffled because there are three Mrs. Astors. And William Waldorf Astor is particularly upset because his wife and his mother are both Mrs. Astor. So who's Caroline to think that she is the Mrs. Astor?
William Waldorf's mother was a level-headed sort who refused to let this upset her. She rather liked her sister-in-law, Caroline, and preferred to keep peace in the family. But William Waldorf persisted. What about his new bride, then? Wasn't she the Mrs. Astor?
It's more a competition between him and Caroline than with the other two women who really don't care. However, William Waldorf Astor loses this battle completely and soon thereafter leaves for England.
But William Waldorf didn't exactly run away from home quietly. He had one last nasty trick to play on his Aunt Caroline and on her only son, John Jacob Astor IV. The same John Jacob Astor who, one fateful day, set sail on a luxurious ocean liner called the Titanic. As the 20th century approached, the Astors thought themselves the wealthiest family in America. Rich, intriguing, the toast of the town, they had virtually created high society in New York. But all was not well with one of America's most watched families. Problems simmered under the surface and finally exploded. The two feuding Astors, William and his Aunt Caroline, clashed on the issue of why Caroline was dubbed the Mrs. Astor. After Caroline won this battle, William and his wife departed for England. William Waldorf was lampooned in the American press for leaving the country, especially after he was quoted saying, "America is not a fit place for a gentleman to live." But it was still a great place to make money, and William Waldorf had an idea. Remembering the success of the Astor House in John Jacob's day, William decided to build an elegant hotel of his own. He would live in England while others ran it. The land was supplied when he demolished the home of his deceased parents. This lot just happened to be right next door to his old nemesis, Aunt Caroline. In an act of spite, William built the hotel on his aunt's doorstep. He called it the Waldorf. William figured that surely his Aunt Caroline would be disrupted and displaced by the new hotel. William's scheme made Caroline's son, Jack Astor, furious. With revenge as his motive, he threatened to tear down his mother's mansion and put up a horse stable next to the fancy new hotel. But William didn't care. When the Waldorf opened in 1897, it was all the rage, the place to see and be seen. The success of the Waldorf inspired Jack to demolish his mother's mansion and build not a stable, but an adjacent hotel. Jack called his the Astoria. The hotels forced the Mrs. Astor to move, but Caroline made the most of it. She built a $2 million chateau farther up Fifth Avenue and furnished it in grand style. Now it was Jack Astor's turn to play a little trick on his cousin. Jack made sure that his Astoria hotel was the taller of the two buildings, so it would cast a shadow on the Waldorf. Well, finally, the cousins agreed on something. In the interest of good business, they decided the side-by-side hotels should be connected, not competitive. The cousins might have been cantankerous, but they weren't stupid. The Waldorf Astoria was the grandest hotel in New York, maybe the world. It was the epitome of elegance. At the super-exclusive Palm Court dining room, reservations were made weeks in advance, and full evening dress was mandatory.
Oddly enough, the rise of the Waldorf Astoria was the fall of the Mrs. Astor. People could be seen in this magnificent setting in all their finery and choose when they went out. They didn't have to wait for Mrs. Astor to give a ball.
In January 1905, Caroline Astor went through her address book selecting the chosen ones to accept what would be her final ball. Later that year, Mrs. Astor had a stroke. For the next 3 years, she was rarely seen. There were rumors that the servants often found her wandering through her reception rooms, greeting invisible guests. Caroline Astor died in 1908 at the age of 77.
One of the last things she said is, "I'm sure that there are many women who will rise up to take my place when I'm gone." And actually, she was wrong. No one has ever taken her place. There has never been anybody who has been like Caroline Astor in her stamp on society.
The death of the Mrs. Astor allowed her only son Jack to consider something scandalous in those days, a divorce. Jack's wife, Ava, was one of the great beauties of her day. Beautiful but imperious. Their son Vincent was, of course, born into enormous wealth, but endured a childhood of emotional poverty. Vincent's mother was a gorgeous woman who found her son to be ugly and awkward. She often scolded him and called him names in front of others. Vincent's father, Jack Astor, was overly formal and strict, but a love of motor cars brought father and son closer together. As a youngster, Vincent was raised by servants, but now that he was older and his parents were divorced, Vincent became one of his father's constant companions. But soon, Jack had another constant companion, a girl younger than his own son. Another scandal. Jack was in his mid-40s, and the girl, Madeline Force, was 18.
It really was viewed as extremely scandalous, and Jack actually had to bribe a minister by paying him $1,000 to marry them. And society turned its back on them.
The newlyweds took a long honeymoon abroad. Soon the young bride was pregnant, so the couple decided to return home to America for the birth of their baby. It was April 1912. A photographer spotted the famous rich American Jack Astor at London's Victoria Station. Astor was waiting for the train that would take him, his wife, and unborn son to their ship. He had booked passage on the newest, safest, and most elegant ocean liner in the world. The name of the ship was the Titanic.
The last picture ever taken of my grandfather is quite a haunting photograph. He's looking straight into the lens, and there's something very spooky about it. It's just kind of like something awful is going to happen.
The super luxurious Titanic suited the super rich Astors perfectly. They were at home in their elegant first-class cabin. Even though Madeline wasn't feeling well due to her pregnancy, she took her husband's arm to tour the salons and stairways of the grandest ship afloat. The Titanic was headed for New York at full speed. Rumor had it that the unsinkable ship was trying to set a new speed record and become famous as the fastest ship to ever cross the Atlantic. Instead, the Titanic struck an iceberg and became famous as a ship of doom. When the captain realized all was lost, he alerted the first-class passengers one by one. Jack Astor calmly awakened his young wife.
He tells her to get dressed, put on all of her warm clothes. They go very slowly. He gets out her jewelry, puts it on her, takes her up above. And it is mayhem. There are men jumping into lifeboats in front of women. It is just a panic.
But Jack Astor refused to panic for fear of upsetting his wife. He knew the ship was sinking fast, so he led Madeline to a lifeboat and told her to get in. To please me, a phrase he often used with her. Madeline clung to him and wanted to stay on board, but she listened to her husband, as she later explained in a newspaper account. It read, "I got into the next to last lifeboat. My husband said, 'The sea is calm, you'll be all right. You're in good hands. I'll see you in the morning.' Then he kissed me affectionately and stood smiling down at me as the lifeboat was lowered. I noticed that the ship was listing as we rowed away. Then I saw the Titanic go down."
He's putting on a very strong front for Madeline. He's being very stoic. He knows the inevitable. He takes her up, puts her in the second to last lifeboat, kisses her goodbye, says, "I'll see you in the morning." And then he helps passengers into the last boat, and he goes on deck, and he waits for the inevitable.
Although she was 5 months pregnant, the young bride helped to row. The night was pitch black, frigid. The lifeboat took on icy water up to the passengers' knees.
And one of the women on the lifeboat said to Madeline that she was so cold she was shivering, she had nothing to wear, and Madeline took off her own shawl and put it around this woman's shoulders. She also, like her husband, showed grace under fire.
7 hours later, Madeline and the others were rescued, but John Jacob Astor, heir to one of the world's great fortunes, was gone. His son, 20-year-old Vincent, was devastated by the loss of his father. Because he was wearing a life jacket, Jack's body was among the hundreds recovered from the wreck site. In his pockets, a gold watch and $2,500 in soggy bills. Vincent arranged the funeral and claimed the watch, a treasured possession for the rest of his life. Soon after the tragedy, Madeline gave birth to John Jacob Astor VI, the baby who almost went down with the Titanic. And so 2 sons survived Jack Astor. One was old enough to be the father of the other. One inherited meager money by Astor standards, while the other got monumental money.
My grandfather, Jack Astor, was coming back after his extended honeymoon for the birth of his child and to change his will. Had he known it was a male heir, he probably would have changed his will much more substantially for the unborn child, my father. But in fact, by Astor's standards, it was quite a modest inheritance.
But the son with the immodest inheritance did something simply amazing with his enormous fortune. It was the beginning of another saga. The loss of Jack Astor on the Titanic changed life forever for his son Vincent. But the death of the father he would never know had an even greater impact on the baby born just 4 months following the sinking of the unsinkable ship. Greater because the baby's inheritance was smaller, significantly smaller. In his will, Jack Astor left almost his entire fortune to his son Vincent. Had he lived, he would surely have changed his will to provide more generously for his second son, but fate dealt a different hand that April night on the Atlantic Ocean.
As a result of the accident of the Titanic, we have always had what amuses the public to hear about, but is not amusing for the family itself, poor Astors and rich Astors.
The poor Astor, baby John Jacob VI, inherited $3 million. The rich Astor was 20-year-old Vincent, who got $87 million. He also inherited most of his father's other personal property, including Caroline's Fifth Avenue mansion. Vincent also received his father's newest hotel, the luxurious St. Regis, and part of the Waldorf Astoria. All in all, his inheritance gave Vincent an incredible income of $10,000 a day. Since the days of the first Astor in America, the family was never known for its philanthropy. In fact, for generations, Astors had been criticized for doing little public good with their enormous wealth, which is why many were surprised when Vincent made this most un-Astor-like statement. He said, "It is my duty to show my gratitude now by taking an interest in great public movements and in every way to attempt to aid mankind." Vincent had a genuine desire to do good deeds. For starters, he built a playground in Harlem on land he could have sold for $1 million. Instead, he built a home for underprivileged children, and he raised the salaries of some family servants.
Vincent is a very different kind of Astor from any of his predecessors. He's the first one who really is troubled by having falling down tenements on his property. It's one of the reasons he disposes of much of this real estate. So in that sense, he was a maverick in that family.
Vincent, the maverick Astor, began doing the unthinkable. He sold real estate. He even allowed the city housing authority to buy Astor-owned slum properties for far less than the market value. In 1929, Vincent and the English Astors sold the once magnificent Waldorf Astoria Hotel, splitting $15 million. The Waldorf was then demolished to make way for the construction of the Empire State Building. 2 years later, a new Waldorf Astoria was built on Park Avenue, where it stands today. Vincent kept the St. Regis because it was his father's pride and joy. As a youngster, Vincent met Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a distant relative by marriage, and they became lifelong friends. The two shared a love of the sea. Vincent even built a special hidden ramp on his yacht, allowing the president's wheelchair to be rolled on board.
He worshipped his father, and but then the person that really had more influence in him and his father was Franklin Roosevelt. He worshipped him too. He had a great influence on Vincent.
Astor was an astute businessman. He invested in a silent film, the first Ben-Hur, and made a tidy profit. In another big departure from the family business, Vincent started a magazine in 1933. When he told his great friend Roosevelt, FDR plunked down $1 and asked to be the first subscriber. The magazine was called Today, but was renamed Newsweek. Meanwhile, in England, another Astor was making newspaper headlines. Her name was Lady Nancy Astor, and no one who heard her speak ever forgot her.
When it comes to moral courage, women have just as much moral courage as some men have immoral courage.
Remarkable and unusual were words often used to describe Nancy Astor, but the whole Astor saga in England could be called unusual. It began with the defection of William Waldorf, who became a British citizen in 1899 after his declaration that America wasn't a fit place for a gentleman. His eagerness for an aristocratic title landed him in American cartoons. But William Waldorf eventually got his wish, some say bought his wish. After years of generous philanthropy in his adopted country, William was made a baron and a member of the House of Lords. He bought several historic properties, including Cliveden, an incredible estate outside London. In the early 1900s, Nancy Langhorne Shaw of Virginia was traveling in England when she met and married William Waldorf's oldest son, Waldorf, who was enchanted with her.
Nancy Astor had a lot of energy, a wonderful dry wit, keen to fight for the underdog. And remember, she was the first woman to take a seat in the British House of Commons.
Some could barely keep a stiff upper lip at the thought of a woman, an American woman yet, in Parliament. Nancy and Waldorf were the original power couple, especially after Waldorf inherited his father's title and estate. A regular who's who of celebrities showed up at Cliveden: Lawrence of Arabia, George Bernard Shaw, Charlie Chaplin. And once, visitors entering Nancy's sitting room found Mahatma Gandhi on the floor turning his spinning wheel. But soon, controversy. A big controversy. In the early 30s, anxiety over Adolf Hitler was widespread in England. There was talk of war. Nancy Astor, however, got caught in a trap. She didn't see Hitler as a threat. Rather, she felt the prospect of war was of greater concern.
I don't believe people who haven't seen it can realize the appalling devastation of the aftermath of war.
She urged England to negotiate with Hitler. That was considered appeasement, an unpopular position. A put-down term was coined to describe those who agreed with Nancy that war must be avoided. The term was the Cliveden set. Winston Churchill was one of Lady Astor's fiercest critics, and even though Nancy was celebrated for her quick wit, Churchill was wittier in one of the world's most famous put-downs.
You probably remember the story of her sitting next to Winston Churchill at dinner. She was very much against drinking, and he enjoyed a glass of brandy. And she turned to him and said, if I was your wife, I'd put poison in that drink. And he turned around and said, well, if I was your husband, I'd drink it.
In 1939, war with Germany put an end to the Cliveden set furor. All of the Astors threw themselves completely into the war effort. The Astor sons joined the armed forces, serving with valor and distinction. Waldorf and Nancy devoted themselves to the city of Plymouth, which was heavily bombed by the Nazis. After the war, Lord Astor persuaded Nancy not to run for Parliament again. Lady Astor called herself an extinct volcano, and it was obvious that she missed politics. In the early 50s, Lord Astor died. Nancy died in 1964, a few days before her 85th birthday. Their beloved Cliveden was given to the government and was opened to visitors. The British Astors thrived and multiplied to such an extent that an American Astor once lamented, "People say the British Astors are a branch of the family, but that's no longer true. Today, they're the trunk and we're the branch." And no one knew that better than Vincent Astor. He was getting older and had no children. What could Vincent possibly do with his immense fortune? By the middle of the 20th century, the Astors had been in the public eye for almost 200 years. Their names synonymous with wealth, power, and high society. And as a result of the generosity of Vincent Astor, the family name now was linked with philanthropy. In 1948, he decided to set up the Vincent Astor Foundation. It was dedicated to, in his words, the alleviation of human suffering. Now in his early 60s, Vincent Astor was on his second divorce. Both were childless marriages, but in 1953, he became reacquainted with a vivacious lady he had known for years, the recently widowed Brooke Marshall. Vincent was smitten, determined to marry the woman he nicknamed Pookie. Brooke was devoted to the moody multimillionaire, and they married later that year. Soon, Brooke had the Astor name back on the society pages, but her time with Vincent was short. In 1959, after only 5 years of marriage, Vincent Astor died of a heart attack at age 67. He left Brooke his fortune and his foundation.
On his death, he left a very large estate of well over $100 million, and he left it specifically not for bankers or male trustees to handle, but he left it to Brooke. And he said, "Oh, Pookie, you're going to have a hell of a lot of fun running this foundation." And she has.
Vincent gave fully half of his estate, $65 million, to the Vincent Astor Foundation. Brooke Astor dispensed the money just as generously. She could have given it away anywhere in the world, but Mrs. Astor chose to spend it within the 5 boroughs of New York City.
And I thought the money was originally made here because John Jacob Astor. So I thought, I'm going to give it back to New York. So that's what I've done.
In 1995, Brooke Astor turned 93. But even progressing years could not keep her from her charitable work. Through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, Brooke remained on the highest rung of high society, and she continued the work of the foundation.
I want to be known for being one of the first people to really go and see what they give to, because I think you can give much more intelligently if you see what you're giving to.
Astor Foundation projects benefit the young, the old, the sick, the healthy, and everyone in between. In 35 years, the foundation has given away more than $150 million and still counting. Many say it's perfect symmetry to have so much of the Astor millions returned to the place it all began more than 200 years ago. The journey of the Astor dynasty has been extraordinary. The characters remarkable. The penniless immigrant who turned a pittance into a fortune. The real estate baron whose purchases earned him the title the landlord of New York. The woman who defined New York high society. The rival cousins whose feuding created the country's grandest hotel. The playboy who met his early demise aboard the doomed Titanic. And finally, the philanthropist and his wife, whose charity has been a precious gift to many. Through the grandeur, the battles, the grief, the Astors endured and created a unique legacy. It's a legacy that is not lost on the current generation of Astors.
I don't think about it every day, but every now and again it dawns on you, think, gosh, it's nice to be connected with a family that has a name of such recognition, to be an Astor.
The poor immigrant named John Jacob Astor would be astounded to see how far his family and his fortune have come. The Astors ruled New York high society for 200 years, a dynasty second to none.